Welcome to our lunchtime seminar today on Wednesday. Very well, happy to welcome Sarah Rhys. We'll talk a little bit, I'll introduce Sarah in a moment properly. I just want us to give little housekeeping notes here. This presentation is recorded, and Sarah is going to share some slides with us. The recording will be available on the cfpr.ue.ac.uk website afterwards. We will have a question and answer session for Sarah later, which Wunjin is kindly offered to lead. There's a chat function on the side, question and answer session as well, which I'll monitor as well. There's some people in the room here as well, eating their lunches, and yeah, so make use of the chat function. Those of you in the room, please come, and I'll pass from round to have to put your questions to Sarah or comments to Sarah. Okay, so thank you, Sarah, for agreeing to join us for lunchtime seminar. A bit of a background: Sarah is an alumni of the MA Multidisciplinary Print course here at UE some time ago now, I imagine. It was, but she's also now she works as a freelance artist and as a member or an associate of Spike Island in Bristol as well, where she works. She works there. She works in Bristol, and she also works in South Wales. So, but more from Sarah directly. So I shall turn my camera off, and I shall start the presentation when you're ready.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you so much for coming today. And thank you to the Centre for Fine Print Research for inviting me to give a seminar on my project, Cryptic Landscape, which was at the National Botanic Garden of Wales until just over a week ago. As Frank was saying, I am an alumni of UE. I did my teacher training, in fact, 20 years ago, where I specialised in design technology, and more recently did my MA Print about 10 years ago. And my publication, Cold Tree, Salt Sea, was also showcased by the Centre for Fine Print Research in 2018. Cryptic Landscape is a very recent exhibition, as I said, having taken it down just over a week ago. It was at the National Botanic Garden of Wales in Carmarthenshire. The title Cryptic Landscape evokes the miniature and mysterious botanical worlds of lichen and moss. These organisms are also cryptogams, which means their reproduction is often unseen. Carl Linnaeus, the 17th century Swedish botanist, known often as the grandfather of taxonomy, which is the science of identifying, naming, and classifying organisms, he described this category as like a hidden marriage. Whereas other plants have stamens and flowering parts and were described as having an open marriage. This is from the ancient Greek kryptos, meaning hidden, and gamos, meaning marriage. I am fascinated with these miniature landscapes, as well as the alchemical landscape and deep time, which can be expressed through geological material. I have previously worked with anthracite coal and rock salt, such as in the long-term project Cold Tree, Salt Sea. Clay, another ancient and geological material, has been of interest of mine for quite some time, and I made a series of casts for this project. I used porcelain and sometimes bone china. So, how did Cryptic Landscape come into being? Well, Cryptic Landscape is a project that evolved out of a collaborative research project called Holobiont that was devised between me and the fellow artist Carolina Whitson. Last year, we developed a relationship with the National Botanic Garden of Wales as artists, and we ran a series of events, both locally and at Spike Island. I began developing a series of works last summer, and as a consequence was offered a space to show my work at the Botanic Garden from November 2021 to January 2022. The space I was given is in a room adjacent to an apothecary, which is an actual Edwardian apothecary that was moved from North Wales. It is full of extraordinary items and potions and is a kind of wunderkammer. Behind the hall is a herb garden that corresponds to the plants used by the physicians of Myddfai, who were 12th century early medics. Myddfai is 20 miles north of the Botanic Garden and is an area steeped in folklore. The National Botanic Garden of Wales is a contemporary botanic garden founded in 2000 with conservation at its heart. It is set in 500 acres of rural land in the Tywi Valley of Carmarthenshire. It is local to where I am from, and I've known it since it first opened. It has a National Seed Bank of Wales and a DNA barcoding project. It is the first nation in the world to DNA barcode its native flowering plants and conifers, and is building on this to DNA barcode the rest of the UK flora. It has a commitment to conserving wild plants and fungi and has substantial native wildflower meadows. I intend to carry on working in partnership with the National Botanic Garden into the near future. Okay, the next slide, please, Frank. So, the botanical worlds of lichen and moss. This piece is a found piece of silver birch bark that had a natural garden of lichen and moss, and I actually had it in my exhibition because I made a series of assemblages, and this particular piece that I called Scroll was amongst them. You must excuse my voice, I've got a bit of a frog in there. Okay, so I'm fascinated with the miniature world of lichen and moss. And in Wales, in certain parts of Wales, as in a lot of Ireland, Devon, Cornwall, and some parts of Scotland, we actually have temperate rainforest in this country, in these pockets that are unfortunately getting rarer and rarer, but they're highly important. And although the Botanic Garden is not in a temperate rainforest, it's near one. And we also, in that area, have really good clean air, and we have beautiful damp climate and a lot of veteran trees. So it's ideal for lichen and moss. Lichen is particularly important as a bioindicator for pollution. I'm not able here to really go too much into the botanical worlds of lichen and moss. I'm going to focus mainly on my work because this is what this talk is about. But however, I will mention that Lynn Megalis, the American botanist and microbiologist, she championed the controversial theory that gave symbiosis a central role in the evolution of early life. And as we know, lichen are a symbiotic life form combining a fungus and an algae, and usually a cyanobacteria and various other yeasts. It's mainly a fungus and algae. And what's extraordinary about the lichen is it's a coming together and staying together of two different organisms, which in one lifespan gains an entire set of abilities and characteristics just in one evolutionary step. So, for example, with the fungus and the alga joining up and combining their skills, the fungus gives the body and roots, and the algae gives the possibility of photosynthesis. Lichens featured prominently in Lynn Megalis's work over the decades. She said that lichens are remarkable examples of innovation emerging from partnership. The association is far more than the sum of parts. So, and moss are also extraordinary plants and have huge importance ecologically. They conserve a huge amount of water, so they prevent flooding, but they also enable water to drip down from trees, drip feeding the soil after rainfall. So in very dry climates after a rainfall, that the moss enabled more moisture to be conserved. And moss are also very early colonizers after volcanic eruptions or fires. Next slide, please, Frank. Okay, so for this project, I ended up making a lot of porcelain and bone china casts. As I was saying, I'm really fascinated in geological material. I was also fascinated in the culture, the 16th century culture of casting life. And nearly every kunstkammer in the 16th century had reptiles and plants cast from life. It was a way of studying nature. unfortunately, some people like Bernard Palissy, who was an extraordinary geologist and ceramicist, but he actually cast live animals. I have to say, I suppose I've done something similar, because once these moss and lichen are cast in the slip cast, they of course no longer are alive. I sort of suspend their life. So I'm fascinated anyway in porcelain. During my time doing the project Coal Tree Salt Sea, I was working with the alchemical ideas of coal, which was described as black gold, and salt, white gold, which is also because of their value. I was interested to discover that porcelain had also been described as white gold for similar reasons. It has a really interesting history about how the quest and the fight for preserving the secrets of creating pure porcelain. So I have to keep moving on. So I could talk about that a lot further, but I don't have the time here today. So I met the ceramicist Rosanna Martin, who studied at the Royal College of Art, and then she went back to Cornwall, where she's from, and she founded a place called Brickworks that closed down during COVID, but now is going to reopen as part of Cast Cornwall in Helston. So I did a workshop with her in 2019. And the idea is that you could bring your ideas of what you wanted to do. So I had already discovered Gillian Lowndes, the ceramicist, and was really interested in some of the slip casting that she had done. And I came to the workshop with Rosanna with a huge seaweed root and various other dried plant materials. And I said, I want to cast this in porcelain. And obviously seaweed's quite gelatinous. It's not the easiest material to cast. And it didn't survive the firing, not surprisingly, but in fact, what happened, it fragmented, and the fragments I found really, really interesting. And I mean, I hadn't used porcelain before, so maybe for someone who has, they wouldn't have found it so fascinating, but I just thought it was so interesting, the correlation between the fragments that survived and bone and coral. And I find that so much with botanics, for example, looking at lichen. There's some lichen that look like coral, there's some that look like miniature trees, and these wonderful shapes are quite uniform throughout the plant world. So the first image we see on the left, that is slip cast in bone china, and it's unfired. The one in the middle is a very, very long piece of moss, that's porcelain, and the third one is a really tiny piece of moss that I think is, in fact, very beautiful, and it's quite extraordinary that it has survived. It's been to Wales and it's come back to Bristol, and they are extremely fragile, but I think they're quite beautiful. Next slide, please, Frank. So it's possible that moss, in fact, preempted lichen, but it's mainly believed that lichen was the first plant form that came onto Earth because it could combine the algae and the fungus. So the fungus gave the roots, and the algae allowed it to photosynthesize. But there is a theory that it was the moss that first came on to the Earth from the water, but because moss doesn't leave any trace fossils, it's impossible to know, whereas lichen does leave fossil traces. So I was interested here again in the cryptogram, which means the hidden marriage, and the whole kind of idea of what is not seen, the unseen. So this is actually the underneath, it's a print from the underneath it's a print from the underside of a moss, and you get the natural dyes that have seeped into the water. And you also, intriguingly, get the little pathways that have been made by different creatures that live in moss. And having spent time at the Botanic Garden looking through microscopes, it is quite extraordinary what lives in even a small, small piece of moss. Okay, so next slide, please, Frank. So this one is called extremophile. And in Cryptic Landscape, this was part of an assemblage, so there were several other objects. in this particular case. I was given 2 really beautiful antique cabinets, display cabinets to use, made from lovely old antique wood that had mirrors in the back. So you got this wonderful repeated mirroring that would happen. And I also laid much of the work on blackboards, some of which had drawings on, so the trace drawings on those blackboards too. But they also give a kind of sense of being out of space, out in space. So extremophile, well, it's interesting because lichen cover, in fact, 8% of Earth's surface. That's because it can live in very, very marginal extreme realms that other life forms can't tolerate. In the wonderful book, Merlin Sheldrake's book, Entangled Life, How Fungi Make Our Worlds, Change Our Minds and Shape Our Futures, he talks about how NASA and the European Space Agency as well took various organisms out to space to see how they might survive solar radiation. And lichen were just extraordinarily resilient, and exposed to shielded radiation, nearly every organism they're taken up there just died completely. They took up lichen and various fungi and some other sort of bacteria. And it was absolutely astonishing when they exposed lichen to unshielded radiation, which is just unimaginable that it could survive that. It survived. So there are these notions going around that perhaps lichen come from outer space, which I guess means potentially coming to Earth on meteorites at a different point to life evolving on Earth. But then, of course, if you think about it, we're all from outer space anyway. But here I found this really extraordinary, like an egg iron nugget. And so I'm sort of putting those ideas into this artwork here. So next slide, please. So here I'm going to talk about materials and process. So with a lot of experimentation, I began slip casting pieces of moss and lichen. I would generally tie some fishing wire or string to the lichen and moss, and then dip it into different solutions of porcelain slip. So porcelain slip is basically, as any clay slip is, it's a very watered down version of clay. So it's a liquid clay basically. And then I would let each piece dry, drip dry in my studio, sometimes giving it a second coating and sometimes not. And then, yes, I mean, I love the whole dialogue about being an artist. I had various people come to my studio, and a friend came and she brought a ceramicist in who suggested also looking at bone china clay for various reasons, which I did. So in fact, the one on the left and the one on the right, in fact, which were the latest ones, are bone china. And I decided not to fire those because if I had fired them, I'd have lost all those wonderful little hairs, spore hairs that you get on this, that you get on many pieces of moss. And the same one here. And amazingly, these survived transportation as well. That's about 17 centimeters long. And this little one is probably about 4 centimeters. So yeah, strip drying and then just packaging them very, very carefully. And again, I generally display them on the blackboards as well. So some of the works I fired, and some of them were cracked before they went in. Some of them remained cracked when they came out, and some of them have an intrinsic sort of fragility and beauty. And the ones that are fired as well tend to be a bit more shiny. But I also really like the unfired versions because they're very chalky. And I like the fact they're fragile, and I've often worked with worked with fragile materials. Okay, so next slide, please, Frank. And here we have an assemblage of different casts on a blackboard. So here we have a variety of lichen and moss. You just get some really unusual shapes, and to me there's like such animacy in lichen and moss. I'm really kind of quite besotted with the whole world of lichen and moss, but even when they're cast like this, they just have such extraordinary forms. So I feel, in a way, by slip casting them in clay and firing them, or even not firing them, you're sort of suspending the animacy. And like the 16th century artists and ceramicists who made casts, you eliminate all color generally, so you also just can concentrate more on the form and see details you might not see otherwise. So yes, I've touched on transportation. So to transport them to Wales, it was a bit of a worry that they wouldn't survive. And the one in the middle that I showed you earlier as well, that's unfired, and you can actually see the moss coming through. But it was extraordinary that, because I couldn't wrap it entirely because if it had any material touching those delicate areas, they would have just sort of broken. So I had to make these sort of big dips in bubble wrap and just package them in such a way that they wouldn't move. Anyway, they survived, which was brilliant. Okay, and next slide, please. So another area of work that I made for this exhibition were analog 60mm film. So I made lichen tapes. Some people may have been familiar, my colleagues in Bristol might be familiar with my dust tapes that I made for the Centre of Gravity last year. There's a big exhibition in Bristol where I did a dust archaeology of the building and applied those traces and tapes to clear leader, which can then be run through a projector. And I was interested in that whole process, and I've made something using similar techniques in this case. So it's a low-tech analog method pioneered by someone called Sam Brackage, an American. He pioneered it in the 60s. So basically, you use transparent tape. I pulverized some lichen, making a lichen dust, and also applied directly to the transparent tape pieces of lichen, and on the top right, a small piece of seaweed. So these are just tiny little stills from, meters and meters and meters of film, which I displayed in a glass cabinet in the Botanic Garden, sort of wrapped in a particular way, so that the film was really on display as material, as a sculptural object. So you have sprockets running through the 60mm clear leader. So as I said, it can be run through a projector, which I haven't done in this case as yet. It does fragilize the film hugely. And also I find when you run it through a normal projector, the images go through so fast, you're not able to appreciate the minutiae. So I sometimes I have run it through a Steenbeck, which is a very early editing machine. So you run it through the Steenbeck and it magnifies the film so that you can create stills from that. Okay, next slide, please, Frank. Okay, so one of the starting points for this project was a fascination with this transplant, this successful transplant technique that was evolved. It's very simple. There's tree lungwort lichen, which is getting rarer and rarer. It's very fragile because if the tree is felled or dies, the lungwort dies with it. And it's a really important plant. And it can only grow in very clean atmospheres. So it's extraordinary, it's getting very rare. Anyway, a botanist discovered a technique which is actually quite simple. Like I was saying, it just managed to attach a piece of lichen, lungwort lichen, to a mesh and then stapled this to a tree that's low in acid. Lichen don't like acidic surfaces. So this particular tree, a willow tree, was very low in it, and it's been successful. So I knew I definitely wanted to make a response to this idea. And also, just, there's so much sort of ecological destruction that is going on all the time. To have something that's kind of An example of humans actually helping nature in this way is really quite wonderful. So I wanted to respond to this, kind of healing and resilience. So I was wondering what mesh to use. And then I realized that when I trained it as a design technology teacher, I had used honeycomb aluminium, and I got some from British Aerospace, and I still had some at home. It's a really beautiful material that does look like honeycomb. And the hexagonal shape that you get in natural honeycomb, or the hexagram, is basically the strongest shape in nature. And it sort of symbolizes resilience and healing. So I began working with porcelain and honeycomb aluminium, and this piece evolved. And to me, it speaks of the fragility of earth and nature, but also, interestingly enough, that the pieces of porcelain fall out of the hexagrams, and they end up looking a bit like they reminded me of the kind of basalt rocks that you get in the Giant's Causeway, but also they are like a chalk, and as they're placed on a blackboard, each time I move it, it actually makes a trace drawing on the blackboard as well. Okay, next slide, please, Frank. So continuing to use this material, I was thinking about hidden marriage, the cryptogam. And as I was saying, Linnaeus has said that he wasn't able to categorize lichen and moss originally because he didn't understand how they kind of reproduced, and they didn't fit in with all the other flowers and stamens and everything. So I thought it was quite interesting when he called the cryptogam like hidden marriage, and all other plant forms were open marriage. And I thought of the kind of correlation between the female human body as well, and the fact that all the kind of reproductive aspects are hidden, and it's sort of, and at the time of Linnaeus, I mean, sex was highly taboo still, but it was interesting in the sense at the time because botany gave people an opportunity to use a language to describe the sex lives of plants, and that actually enabled them to have a language with which to sort of talk about sex within humans. But it was very taboo, and of course, in those days, botany was seen as really an unsuitable subject for women. And Linnaeus and his followers were often called the sexualists. But anyway, yeah, so that's my piece, Hidden Marriage. Okay, so next slide, please, Frank. So as I was saying earlier, I created a lot of assemblages. There were 14 works of art in my exhibition. There were 6 assemblages in these antique cabinets. They had 3 sections each. And then there was a really beautiful contemporary glass cabinet that was bought by the Botanic Gardens. And I had 5 pieces in there. So this is an assemblage, and it became an archival digital print. Okay, and next slide. And that's the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening. And it's over to you, Frank.
Right, there was some. We just missed the applause just a moment ago. Can you hear me? Here you go. There's more applause coming up. Okay. Thank you, Sarah. It was very. I don't know whether there's any questions from the audience, from the esteemed audience in the room. Claudia Koch asked whether you said slip in your talk, but maybe we can talk about the art of slip casting a bit longer, a bit more.
Sure. Maybe go back to those images. So image, the second image, isn't it? Just get the image. If you get image 3 up, Frank, if that's okay. So, I mean, the way I'm using it, oh yeah, this one's great. There's many different types of slip cast. So I've used it perhaps in a slightly unconventional way. Because slip casting can be used by ceramicists. They might, for example, make a bowl, and then they will pour in liquid clay into the bowl, pour it out, and then fire it, and you'll get a very thin layer of porcelain, for example. So I've used it in a different way. The idea of making a clay cast with material is that when you put you dip the material into the clay once or twice, and you have sort of like a new surface, a clay surface, and then when you put that into a kiln, it will burn away all the material inside, and you end up with a hollow shape, and hopefully a perfect replica of the shape of the object that you have fired. But I also was intrigued by not firing the work as well. For example, the piece on the left is completely unfired, so the object is covered in clay, but it's not fired, and therefore it's very fragile. I hope that's, yes, so Claudia is SLIP, S-L-I-P, you're quite right.
Thank you. Yeah. Jin, maybe I can hand over to you if you can come onto the stage. Maybe you have something to add.
Thank you for your beautiful talk, Sarah.
Thank you.
I had a few questions because we're the Centre for Print Research. So I wanted to know if you could speak a little bit about how you've used a very indexical approach to capturing the world. For example, you've taken like direct impressions of lichen, or you have used the actual object itself and captured it within, within porcelain. I was wondering if you could talk about that kind of indexical approach to the printed form, or the way that you're using the actual form to make an image.
Well, I guess just in terms of what I've just said, really, in terms of making the casts, but for me, it was more like suspending and capturing certain qualities by using such a beautiful material as porcelain clay. And in a way, it's a kind of geological act, an alchemical act, like transforming an object into something quite else, but it is recognizable. So I guess in a nutshell, that was my approach.
I mean, it really fascinated me because also there is this element of a kind of sadness, because you often photograph the pieces against the black background, and the quality of the image is also really, really aesthetically beautiful, but it's kind of in a horizonless space. So you've got this kind of difficult sense of where you are and what the scale is and where you are as a viewer. So I wondered if you could maybe talk a little bit about your aesthetics. This is similar to the Wonder Camera, but have you been influenced in that way?
Well, I guess the idea of photographing the objects on blackboards is more to do with the fact that I've used blackboards often in my work. In fact, you can probably see, I'll just push my computer back a bit. I'm actually in front of a huge blackboard painting that I did some time ago. So I do have this fascination with blackboards and the trace. So I don't personally feel sadness when I look at the blackness. And I have had friends comment, actually, artist friends comment, "My God, don't you get depressed? You use so much sort of black and black and white." And I always have, but I don't find it depressing or sad at all. But there's something about just eliminating what isn't essential. And quite meditative in some ways too. I don't know. It's a particular aesthetic.
I guess it lets you focus on the subject without any distractions.
Completely. I mean, some of the blackboards drawings, they're not really quite so visible in this particular slideshow, but there's some have a whole series of writings on them about Linnaeus and the Tree of Life, and I mean, I'm not able to show the whole spectrum here, really. But I guess if you saw them on the actual blackboards, you'd see a lot more depth to them. I mean, when I say depth, I mean it's just literally layers, a palimpsest of layers.
We have a question from David Barron. He comments, "It's interesting that you take a very robust organism capable of surviving radiation in space and turn them into very fragile objects. Do you think that's reflective of the fragility of many of the ecosystems in which these organisms live?
Absolutely. I mean, that's an interesting point in the sense that, you know, as I was saying, some of these lichens will survive the most outrageous, you know, drops in temperature and huge rises in heat and unshielded solar radiation. But at the same time, like the lungwort, you know, it can become extinct incredibly easily, and many lichen will not tolerate much pollution. So I guess that's because that they know that they're also, you know, breathing beings, and that they can't survive too much toxicity. But the great thing is, though, in many ways, when you get triple SIs, and there are quite a few around in that part of Wales, once a site has been deemed to be triple SI, then, for example, that can be used to prevent certain things happening. For example, there was a local huge industrial chicken farm proposal, and that was actually turned down because of a particular woodland that has very rare lichen. So it's interesting, it can sort of tip the argument. But I mean, there's so much we don't know. I mean, lichen are quite extraordinary, and they have so many sort of phytochemicals and chemicals that don't exist in any other plants. And but they've also found you know, antibiotics, antivirals, antibacterial chemicals within these plants. And we're just beginning to learn more about them.
I mean, you said that you thought that they were an amazing symbiotic relationship that had formed you know, something beyond what they would have been on their own. And then you talked about collaborating with another artist in the National Botanic Garden. Do you think you also formed a symbiotic relationship with the collection there, and it's something that you wouldn't have created if you hadn't been there?
Completely. I mean, that was also so wonderful about being there, having the exhibition there for 3 months, and the time prior to that as well. The conversations that you have, meeting a lichenologist, and also working with Carolina in Hollabeyond as well. Just sort of the conversations and the discoveries. But it is an extraordinary place. And I mean, so much of my work anyway kind of evolves through conversations, and I've learned so much, and hopefully through my research, I've got various other ideas that I want to do that are actually kind of very practical in terms of conservation, things that I can do on actual land that I'm looking after, and relationships
Thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Wonjin. Because we're so out of coming off the platform in a moment. Just thank you at this moment to talk about symbiosis. Maybe there's some other symbioses that can be achieved. Center for Print Research as well, and other artists inspired it as well. So have you got any of the work, just for a final question, have you got any of the work coming up on show in Bristol at some point, or at Spike Island at any point where we can see it for real?
Yeah, good question. I'm thinking potentially to work in my studio for 2 days and to have the exhibition in my studio so people can come and see the objects. But I've got an exhibition coming up in Wales next month that I'm part of with a poet called David Greenslade. That's going to be at Volcano Theatre, Swansea. Different work. But yes, and I do hope to exhibit this in Bristol. And I shall, if anyone's interested in that, maybe look at my Instagram or my website, and I shall announce it.
I wanted to ask you if you knew about Bristol Experimented and Expanded Film Group.
Yes, I do. I used to be
a member.
I used to be a member. They're wonderful, and in fact, yeah, I'm very good friends with Vicky Smith, and
oh, wonderful.
Yeah, we have lots of conversations about this, but also, no, I think a lot of the work they do is really interesting, and yes, great organisation.
Excellent. Well, thank you, Wonjin. Thank you for question and answers. Thank you, Sarah, for presenting, and we'll keep in touch. We'll hopefully be able to see the film as well, if it's something going to be presented in the Bristol Experimental Film Festival at some point as well, which would be really nice. So thank you for your presentation. As I said, the seminar is recorded, so it will be available on the CFPR website. For me to finish and saying that our last and next seminar is on the 23rd of February with our own Angie Butler. So please join us then. And until then, nice to see you, Sarah. Thanks for joining us. Thank you, everybody else, for joining us as well. And keep in touch. Goodbye.
Thank you. Bye.